Today I'm turning these denim trousers into a Damascus denim axe along with a Damascus fabric ring. Here you can see I'm cutting off the pockets and any unnecessary junk from the trousers. For this project I went with a light and medium blue along with a black denim for a nice contrast. Once I've got all the waste removed, we can move on to cutting along the stitching of the trousers. Once I've done that for all the trousers, I'm going to be using an oversized template to get the rough size for my handle. I'll be using this template a lot throughout the build to make my mold sizing and for the final shape of my axe. Once I've got the layers of the denim that I need, I'm going to layer them light, medium, dark. This part is what's going to give the contrast later on in the build once we start taking away the layers. As you can see from my bad drawing, the idea for the mold is to have one top side poking in and the bottom side poking out. This will create unevenness within the layers, giving it that Damascus look. For the mold, I went with melamine chipboard as it doesn't stick as much to epoxy, making it easier to split away from the blanks. Now that we got the molds cut up, I'm going back to that original template to get the final shape for the axe. After that, I sketched out the final shape onto my mold so that I know where I'll be putting the holes to create that Damascus design. I drilled out 6 holes on each template, spacing them out as evenly as I could. This step is small but vital, smoothing out the corners. This allows the denim to gradually fade into the next colour instead of having a sharp cut-off. I'm adding small ridges between each circle to give it a less uniform design down the road. If none of this makes sense at the minute, it should in a minute. Now that we've finished the mold that pokes in, we're going to be doing the mold that pokes out. I'm cutting out 10mm plugs, which I will then be rounding off to once again give that smoother transition between the layers. Once I've rounded all 12 plugs, I can move on to the fun part, the epoxy. For this, I'm using Epidex's 2:1 top coat epoxy. This entire project has been a guessing game and the epoxy was the biggest one. I had no idea how much I was pouring, so I had to do a few mixes until I had enough. The main goal when applying the epoxy to the denim is to spread it in as evenly as possible. Doing this for both sides and then adding it to the stack, and then once I've got enough, I'm going to be clamping it down and leaving it for a few days. I came back 3 days later and took the mold off. If you're going to try a project like this, I highly recommend adding tape to the inside of the mold. The melamine does a decent job of not sticking, but adding a layer of tape just ensures that it pops right off. Here you can see the pattern starting to come to life. I went back to the template and marked out on the denim where I wanted the axe to go. Because I was using a top coat epoxy, I did this in 2 separate sections to ensure that the epoxy wouldn't overheat and fail to stick together. I ended up using a wood glue to stick them together, and now we're going to move on to the shaping. I didn't want to use any sharp hand tools, as my worry was that it would catch on a layer and pry them apart, which is why I'm using a Dremel throughout the entire of the shaping process. I also didn't spend too much time sanding in one spot, as I was worried that it was going to overheat. Next is refurbishing the axe head. This was just a whole lot of sanding and sanding, and then some more sanding, and then about 6 hours after sanding, we finally have the axe head ready to remove from the old handle. I made sure to tape off the axe head so I didn't have to go back and do some more sanding. And now we get to see this axe finally come to life. All I really have to do now is add another layer of epoxy to the handle, and then that part is done. This part has to be one of the most satisfying, as we get to see those colours come to life. I didn't end up filming a whole lot for the sheath. The main goal for this was to get the shape and angle of the head correct. I did most of this by eye, so I couldn't tell you what angles I actually used. Once I've got all the pieces cut out and angled, I'm going to be doing a dry fit to make sure everything works well, and then I'm going to be doing a final glue up on this. I wanted to go a bit creative for the sheath, so I went with a magnetic latch system to lock in the axe head. Now all I really have left to do is to sand and finish the sheath, but before I show the end result, I want to move on to making these Damascus fabric rings. This part of the project is very DIY friendly. All you really need is a drill and some kind of saw. For this example, I'm using a bandsaw, but a coping saw works just fine. For this, I'm going to start off by cutting the inside diameter of the ring. Then you want to mark out a few mil over the final thickness and cut to the edge of that marking. Then we go back to the drill, where I flip it on its side and use it as a lathe. By using a razor blade, I trim down both edges and then the middle, ensuring it's completely flat. After that, you're going to want to super glue some fabric to the outside of the ring, creating that unevenness later on. Then cut out thin strips of fabric. I went with a blue and a black and a blue and a red for 2 separate rings. Since I can't use a mold to secure the denim on this, I'm going to be using a fish wire. I'm going to be wrapping this along and then across, making sure to go in between the grooves. This ensures that there won't be any air pockets for when we soak it in epoxy. Next, I'm going to be dry wrapping it around the ring, making sure to go in between the layers for each wrap. This will add the contrast later on. Once we've got the fish wire wrapped around it, we can move on to mixing the epoxy. Once again, I did a 2-to-1 top coat epoxy for this, and then after I've done that, I'm going to be soaking the ring in it for about 20 to 30 minutes before hanging it up to dry. Once we've left it to dry for about 24 hours, we can move on to the shaping. The ring has a tendency to overheat, which we don't want, so I'm keeping my thumb along it just to ensure that it doesn't get too hot, separating the plies. Once we're done with that, we can move on to the finished result. These rings turned out absolutely sick. I'm a big fan of the red and the blue, as it gives off kind of a Spider-Man web theme. If you want one of these rings but you can't be bothered to make it, just hit me up on Instagram at Boardwalk Joinery. You can go as creative as you like for the colour scheme. I do plan on making a proper website at some point in the near future, but for now this axe will be up on my Etsy account, link in description. If you enjoyed watching the video, please consider dropping a like or a sub. I don't really know what my next project's going to be, so consider dropping a comment with your ideas. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.